In the last video, we saw the debt peak. We saw that over time, as we go out and we spend what we earn and then we go and borrow more money, eventually we buy things and hit a peak where the bank says no more lending. Also, it's not just us as individuals that hit this debt peak. Companies also do the same. And the government, after we go into a declining phase where we pay back our loans and we reduce our spending, after the government saves that enough times and comes in and starts spending itself to save us and keep the economy going, after it does that enough times, the government also runs into a debt peak. What that means is, with no more avenues, the government spent all its money, we've spent all our money, companies have spent all their money. Interest rates have also fallen really, really low after multiple times of this occurring. We get to a point where the last resort is money printing. Today we're going to talk about money printing. At that debt peak, there are 4 ways you can reduce the debt, and one of them is to spend less, which no one wants to do. The other one is to take from the rich and give to the less rich. The other one is to also default. You cannot pay your loan back and the bank loses money. None of us really want to do that. And then there's the money printing. So when they talk about money printing, they also often refer to the central bank, which is the bank of the country. They refer to that as the lender of last resort because they're the last ones who've got the money to be able to lend to everyone else. You can print money. Printing money is not just a free thing you can do. You can't just print money and just print endless amounts of money. There's always going to be a consequence. And one of the biggest consequences is that when they print money, what they do is, and if you do look at the link below in my comments, you can learn more about this, but they reduce the long-term interest rate. So when you bring the long-term interest rate down, you often increase the value of certain things, right? So when you bring the interest rate down, you've got the short-term and the long-term interest rate. When you bring the long-term interest rate down, you increase the price of houses, the prices of shares, longer-term things. And the wealthy people, they're pretty happy because it's the wealthy that have property and shares and businesses and all these things, and the prices of those go up when you're printing money. So they're pretty happy over here, the wealthy people, but the less wealthy are not always so happy. So often you'll have people who are retiring, and let's say they're not that wealthy, they're retiring, and let's say they've got a certain amount of money, maybe a couple of $100,000 or $100,000 in the bank. And they have to live off that in their retirement, and it's only earning, think of what interest rates are now, let's say 2.5%, 2.5%. So they're now earning $2,500 on their $100,000 in their bank. And they're thinking, well, I've got to live off this for the rest of my life. How can I get a higher return than 2.5%? Now, they might not necessarily have been thinking that way if they were getting 5% or 7.5% in the bank, like we were getting once upon a time if you go back 10 years ago or so. So these people aren't happy. These people are happy. And so these people get upset at these people. And that's what we call some sort of social unrest. And Ray talks about that, but there's social unrest developing. You've also got first home buyers. If you think the first home buyers have seen prices of houses go up, not recently, but in the last 5-10 years, go up so much that they've kind of stopped buying houses and have in fact often lived with their parents. There's a big trend about living longer with their parents or moving back in with their parents, which a lot of people don't want to do, but they do that because the house prices have gone up so much. So there are effects when you print money, and they're just a couple of them, those effects there. Now you've also got this issue where if you print too much money, you might get an inflation. So you can also get inflation, which is really bad for the less wealthy, because if you double the money supply, so if you put double the amount of money into the economy, in theory, everything like property and shares should double in price just because you put double the amount of money in the economy. Not just the shares and the property, but also things like food go up in price, petrol, all these things that the less wealthy have to pay for, so do the wealthy. but they've got the asset increase. These guys don't have as many assets, so they don't get that benefit. And this starts becoming a bigger number of people who start getting upset at these people over here. And so what happens is these have all the votes, these people, and they might vote in governments that favour what they want. And all of a sudden, there's that social unrest, and things become less safe. And that's the problem when you have a big divergence in people and wealth, and money printing can create that divergence. Now, Ray Dalio talks about something called a beautiful deleveraging. A beautiful deleveraging is quite an interesting concept whereby, before I mentioned the debt peak, really the only way to solve a debt peak is to get to the core of the problem, which is the debt, and we want to pay down that debt. Now, the problem with paying down debt is what I've spoken about many times, is that you reduce your spending, and when you reduce your spending, companies get in less profits, and they sack their workforce, and then the workforce has less money. It becomes a bad deflationary spiral, and you really don't want that either, because then you have lots of unemployed people that are really unhappy. So you start to print money, and Ray says if you print enough money to make up for the fact that the banks have stopped lending money to these very indebted people, companies, individuals and governments, if you print enough money just to satisfy their needs and fill the gap, you can get a beautiful deleveraging where the economy doesn't head down, doesn't necessarily go up a lot either. He calls it the slow growth economy. But then you do get the ability to reduce the interest rates. That's what the money printing does. It reduces interest rates in the long term. You've got the cash rates low, the interest rates, and so you can pay off your debt. You pay down your debt while maintaining your employment and your income growth, just enough to be able to pay down the debt and then come out of the whole issue of too much debt. And that is the best case scenario. Often what will happen is it won't work so well. You get either a downturn or recession, potential depression situation, or you overprint. So you've either got that situation, or you overprint and you get an inflationary situation, and that's also a terrible situation to be in. If you go back to the US in the late 1970s, through the 50s and 60s, the US had wars, and in 71 they broke the standard for the gold standard, and they were printing and printing a lot of money and so on, and so they got an inflation also with an oil shock, and together they got a really high inflation. And the average person went to the supermarket and they saw prices going up. Every time they'd go to the supermarket, they started getting really upset. The money they'd worked so hard to earn in their bank account was now buying them such little amounts of items and foods and goods and services. They got upset, and they said to the government, with their voting power, they said, hey guys, fix this inflation problem. And the government put pressure, and the central bank over there finally got the ability, the Federal Reserve got the ability to increase interest rates without getting kicked out of power. They increased the interest rates all the way to 20%. Paul Volcker put it up to 20% just to be able to calm the inflation down. Now, if you think of what a 20% interest rate would do, house prices fell, share prices fell, the economy went down, you went into that more recession, depression period, and it was still okay by the people. I mean, they weren't happy, but they were okay because they knew that the inflation, they were willing to put up with the recession because they knew how bad the inflation was, and that there was a trade-off there. So it's a few circumstances. You don't want a depression, recession. You don't want to have too much inflation. You try to get that beautiful deleveraging situation, and that's the most you can hope for in a situation like that. But I hope that explaining this now makes you understand how it all kind of works together when you're listening to these different concepts in the economy.